Okay, this talk is titled From Killarney to Jarama by Lin Clark. It's the story of International Brigades volunteer Robert Hilliard, and it's a very personal story delivered by Lin, who is his granddaughter. As she says herself, this is a warts and all biography. It acknowledges the heroism that led him to fight and die in the Spanish Civil War, the antifascist war, a long way from his birthplace in Kerry, and a long way from the comfortable and prosperous life his parents had envisioned for him. But it also unflinchingly looks at the impact some of his decisions had on his family. Last year, as part of this festival, I gave a talk called Fighting for Two Republics, the Irish in the British battalion of the International Brigades. And I wrapped it up by giving some quotes from brigaders who had fought. And the last quote I used was actually from Robert Hilliard. And it was, "I still hate fighting, but this time it has to be done. Unless fascism is beaten in Spain and the world, it means war and hell for our kids." And afterwards, Lynn came up and we were chatting and said she was writing a biography. And it was brilliant to hear because everybody knows the famous Christy Moore song, Fable the King of Brigada, where he names some of the brigaders who fought, and one of them is Bob Hilliard. As he says in the song, Bob Hilliard was a Church of Ireland pastor from Killarney across the Pyrenees he came. Really intriguing story. What the information that we knew about Bob Hilliard was a cleric, a communist, a pugilist, an Olympian, and an International Brigader. So many elements to that story that was never really teased out. So it's really brilliant that Lin is going to tell the full story today and that the book is out there. That quote, "I still hate fighting and it means war and hell for our kids." How accurate that was, because today, by coincidence, is the anniversary of the bombing of Guernica. We're in a few years after the bombing of Guernica, the lessons that were learned when the Nazis bombed that on behalf of the Spanish fascists spread across Europe and across Britain. So the fight that Robert died for was a fight for humanity, and it's a fight that still continues today. Sadly, today in Dublin, there's probably the largest far-right march that has taken place since the 1930s. There's up to 20,000 racists marching in Dublin today with Conor McGregor as a figurehead. So the lessons of history are so important, and the sacrifices that people like your granddad made are so important and so relevant that we hear their stories, learn the lessons, and continue. The best, as people always say, the best tribute we can pay to people like Bob Hilliard and all those who died fighting fascism in the 1930s and 40s is to make sure it doesn't take hold today. So with that, very delighted to introduce Lynn, who's going to tell us the story of Robert Hilliard.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you very much, and thank you for that great introduction. You've got the picture of the book there, and you've also got a picture of my granddad, my maternal grandfather, and the history that shaped him. It's in some ways the story of an everyman, this story, because he wasn't a man of, he wasn't some sort of icon of particular virtue or saintly merit. He was somebody who always wanted to do the right thing, but he was no saint, believe me. So if you want to read about some kind of paragon of virtue, you'll have to buy a different book. But anyway, for me, this story began when I was a child of about 8 years old, when my mother first told me that her father had been killed in the Spanish Civil War. And obviously in a very childish way, I began to pick up the inconsolable sense of grief and loss that she was still feeling as a young woman. She was still having dreams at that time, that she was chasing after her father in the street and that he would turn around and look at her without any recognition or love. And this was, like this recurrent nightmare that she had. And I learned years later than that, or in the ensuing years, that he'd been killed at the Battle of Jarama in 1937 at the age of 32. And by the time I started writing the story down in about 2014, I knew a lot about his personal qualities. He was funny, he was eloquent, he inspired tremendous affection in people. He was a clever scholar. He was physically a little man, small, with mismatched eyes that needed glasses, but even so, he was a reckless and tenacious boxer. Politically, he was a Republican. from his school days onwards, later a socialist, and eventually a communist and an anti-fascist. But he made a lot of startling changes in his life, and there were so many mysteries and paradoxes that I was setting out to get to the bottom of. He was a clever, promising student, but he left Trinity College Dublin without even trying to complete his degree. He was a skilled debater, but he abandoned the debating rooms to focus exclusively on boxing. He became a dissolute, drunken, gambling-addicted journalist, but after a sudden epiphany on, of all places, a London bus, he declared that he'd been called to the Church of Ireland priesthood. And then, although he was a very popular and respected clergyman who could fill, St Anne's Cathedral in Belfast, within a few years he'd left his church post. And above all, what tormented my mother was that he was a loving, hands-on father, but he left his family. And in doing so, he left a terrible legacy of grief and also anger. He moved to London, he joined the Communist Party and into, of course, the International Brigades, and he left for Spain, and he was dead within 3 months. So when this book was launched in Dublin, journalist Clodagh Finn introduced it, and she said, I had written the women back into the story. And I was really pleased she said that, because that was definitely something I wanted to do. But I soon realised when I was writing that I'd also have to write something else back in, because Robert Hilliard was a socialist, and I was never going to understand all these paradoxes I've just outlined unless I wrote workers' struggles back into the story as well. So the underlying proposition embodied in this book, as set out in the prologue, is, and I'm going to quote, "This is a story of a man whose irreconcilable personal conflicts arose from the political struggles of his times. Only if viewed through the lens of those struggles does his life make sense. It's a narrative..." Can you all hear me? Is that better? Okay. "It's a narrative that's as much about the history that made him as the man himself." So to get to grips with Hilliard as a personal level, I did the things biographers do. I went back to primary sources. I followed his footsteps around Ireland and Spain. I talked to people who had known him, and I had some of his belongings, and the remaining family papers and photos, and a few of his letters, only a few sadly, survived. And it's been a great exploration. But I also tried to immerse myself in the history that shaped him. And it's the interaction between the personal and political that I'm going to try and focus on today. So I'm going to tell it with the aid of a very small selection of photos, because unfortunately in those days people didn't always whip out a camera when you wish they had. And I hope to illustrate at least some key things in his story, and also with a few readings from the book as well as what I say. So could we have the second picture? This is the Hilliard family. That's Robert on the right with his mum and his youngest brother on her lap, his half-sister, another sister, his dad, and his next sister down was Moll, his great playmate. They were an aspirational family who'd literally pulled themselves up the social ladder by their bootstraps, because they ran a factory selling boots, and they also ran a shop. This was in Killarney in the southwest of Ireland, about 200 miles from Dublin. And the business was run by this man, also called Robert, and his brother John. And by the time this was taken, their business was the largest single employer in Killarney. And I think, this is 1912 you're looking at, and I always look at this photo and I think, you just don't know what's going to hit you, do you? Because within 2 years, a world war had started. The War of Irish Independence was about to start. At some point within the next 10 years, that rather, I'd say, smug-looking little boy in the sailor suit would have turned against all the conservative and loyalist ideas of his family for good. Now, Robert's father, pictured there, loved classical Greek and Latin, and he'd been dragged back from his classical studies in Trinity College Dublin to help run the family business, very unwillingly. And he was a disappointed man as a result. So he decided that young Robert was going to have to fulfill his own ambitions, sort of by proxy. And he tutored Robert from a very early age. By the time you see him there, he was already pretty fluent in classical Greek and Latin because of the tutorials his father gave him. He was told, you must go to Trinity College, you must study hard, get a good degree, and get a professional career or become a clergyman or an academic. You know, you must do all the things your father couldn't do. And he wanted to please his father, but it has to be said that times were changing very fast in Ireland. And so the British-run establishment, where his father hoped he would find a niche, was ultimately on his way out. The growth of trade unions, the period known as the Great Unrest, had already started in Ireland and in Britain. It started in 1911. And then you had the Dublin lockout in 1913. These were all signs that Irish workers, Protestants in many cases as well as Catholics, were increasingly determined to challenge the social order. And of course every workers' fight back also was presented a challenge to British rule. And in 1913 there was a beginning of a unionist backlash when the British government passed a bill allowing Ireland a sort of limited kind of devolution called Home Rule. Protestant leaders in the north, backed by British Tories, started organising the Ulster Volunteers, a unionist paramilitary force, which went marching and drilling and importing a huge amount of guns from Germany. And in 1914, in response, the Irish Volunteers, which was a Republican paramilitary force, started to march in the south. And as you can tell, I'm telescoping a lot of huge topics here, and you could do a talk in any one of these, so apologies if for the shorthand way of describing these events. But I want to jump forward to 1916, when against this background, and 2 years into World War I, Robert, who by then was aged 11, was scooped up and sent off to boarding school. And they sent him to one school where he was very unhappy, so then he was moved on after a term to Cork Grammar School, where he started in January 1916, and he would be there for 4 years. And this picture, I'd just like to say a few things about it. Within Cork Grammar School, there was absolute loyalty to the British government and the Allied war effort. And the school had a very militarised atmosphere with an officers' training corps. Obviously, lots of the boys had family members fighting on the Western Front. But outside the school, times were desperate because there were these terrible war shortages, desperate shortage of food. One measure of hardship is always infant mortality. 1 in 8 Cork children died in infancy. But despite all of this, it was against the law under the Defence of the Realm Act to criticise the Allied war effort or British rule in Ireland. So you saw lots of Union Jacks everywhere, and Cork looked like a loyal city. But this veneer was cracking. And just to read another quick clip from the book, on Friday, 17th of March, 1916, the 4,000-strong annual St. Patrick's Day parade marched through the centre of Cork. For the first time, it included no contingent of British troops. The parade committee had refused to permit their inclusion and instead allowed 1,000 Irish volunteers to take part, many carrying rifles and pikes. The music of the bands would have reached Cork Grammar School. Did the boys notice the absence of British tunes and realise what it presaged? And there they are, marching through Cork on St. Patrick's Day with their rifles and pikes and the crowds looking on. And if we could have the next picture, please. This is Robert, shortly after this, at home for the Easter holidays, looking a bit unhappy, as he well might. He'd been to 2 boarding schools in less than 2 terms. There were lots of things worrying the Hilliard family that Easter. But he was in Killarney for the holidays when the Easter Rising began. And part of the plan for the Rising was that guns were going to be landed by ship at Fennet Harbour, about 30 miles from Killarney. And the ship was intercepted by the authorities and the guns never reached Ireland. So while the Easter Rising raged in Dublin, police and soldiers were trooping around Killarney and other nearby places, arresting all the Irish volunteers who'd been involved in this enterprise of landing these guns. And after Robert went back to school, the British government started executing the leaders of the Rising, and there was a furious, as you can imagine, furious reaction against this across Ireland. And one of the executions was by firing squad of a man who hadn't even taken part, called Thomas Kent. He was shot by firing squad in Victoria Barracks, as it was then called. It's now called Collins Barracks, just up the hill from Robert's school. And suddenly there weren't so many Union Jacks in Cork. People were taking them down. And they were also trying to put up the Irish tricolour flag, which was illegal. And then, in 1917, news of the Russian Revolution spread around the world, and it transformed the Irish labour movement. There was a massive wave of strikes, which affected everyone's lives. And in the eyes of the British government, this was Bolshevism, and it was a terrible threat. So again, a short passage from the book. Thousands of workers joined the Irish Transport and General Workers' Union. By the end of 1917, it had 4,000 members in Cork. Strikes repeatedly disrupted daily life. Building workers, tram workers, bread van drivers, wool mill hands, gas plant staff, dock labourers, and many more went on strike or threatened to. Even the privileged grammar boys learned how effective strikes could be when the school's coal and bread deliveries were disrupted or the trams used by day boys failed to run. With the growth of Russian Soviets or workers' councils, the word Soviet entered the language of Irish revolt. During the Irish Revolution, there would be at least 100 self-dubbed Soviets as workers took control of workplaces or towns. Not all strikes were successful, but many more were than before the war. So many men were at the front that a unionised workforce could sometimes win its demands with a strike warning. This in turn encouraged more strike warnings and more strikes. And these strikes were accompanied by very large demonstrations which would begin at the railway station, which was just down the hill from Robert's school. They'd march along what was then called King Street, it's now called McCurtain Street, which is, again, really quite close to the school it passes, into St Patrick's Street, the city centre. And there'd be a huge noise, there'd be bands playing and shouting, and as they got into the centre of town, eventually they would be attacked by the RIC, the Royal Irish Constabulary, and there would be a riot. And this happened again and again throughout 1917. It wasn't just trade unionists, it was also the Irish volunteers who flouted the Defence of the Realm Act by marching repeatedly. And so Robert's school was sort of very much, you could say, at the hub almost of all of this tremendous upheaval, social upheaval, and in due course, the savage repression from the British Crown. By 1918, the crowds which these events attracted were winning control of the streets in Cork, and the police, couldn't control them. And in particular, there was a massively successful general strike in April 1918, which actually succeeded in stopping the British government from conscripting Irish men and sending them to the Western Front. The success of this strike, I always think this is a tremendous event when you think, the plan was to conscript all of Irish men, and the strike was able to stop that. It happened in the north, the south, it pulled in Protestant as well as Catholic workers. It was absolutely solid. It was a tremendous thing. And it made it very hard. The Western Front was short of soldiers. It was a real blow to the Allied war effort. And the British were very worried, because if strikes like this, the British government was very worried, if strikes like this spread to Britain or the colonies, the rest of the empire, it was going to be death for the war effort. So they decided to, they sent in 12,000 troops, and the whole struggle for Irish independence and for social change became very much more militarised as time went on from then onwards on both sides. But the strikes did continue. The British would throw everything at Ireland, as we know. They brought in the Black and Tans, they brought in the auxiliaries, to paramilitary forces that used terror against civilians. And it became progressively a more militarised struggle. But you still had very solid general strikes, along quite a series of them. And in 1919, you had Limerick, run by strike committees at one point, the Limerick Soviet, for weeks, basically under workers' control. Same thing happened in Belfast shortly afterwards, or sometime afterwards, the same year. And I should note at this point that Sinn Féin did not back workers' struggles and was committed to a new Irish state with its class divides preserved intact. So you had two strands, really, of this revolt against British rule going on. You also had the Irish volunteers, who would soon become known as the IRA, or became known as the IRA, who were fighting this as a guerrilla war. Robert left Cork Grammar in 1920, spent a year in Mountjoy in Dublin, and I'm going to have to glide through that very quickly. But I will say, by the end of it, he emerged as an ardent Republican and an outspoken opponent of British rule in Ireland, as we would learn from his, we could learn from his contributions to Trinity debates. But I wanted to just read a quote from Irish historian Emmett O'Connor about his time in Cork, that period in Cork. Strikes, demonstrations, and the spirit of revolt had generated a heady mood. There is no denying the extraordinary class triumphalism that gripped the people. This counter-politics stood for the rejection of capitalism and the celebration of solidarity, spontaneity, and direct action. So although Robert, obviously he was still a boy, he wasn't a socialist yet, but I suspect that the seeds of it were sown in Cork. I'm going to sort of fast forward here and leave out Robert's time at Mountjoy, his time at Trinity College, which was a fascinating time because I'm going to have to leave out the Irish Civil War because I want to whiz through to a later phase of his life. So that means also leaving out his boxing career. I think I describe the Irish Civil War as a counter-revolution in the book. It certainly made Robert abandon politics in the debating room. He took to boxing. He became an Olympic boxer. I'm even going to skip that story. And on the way back from Paris, where the Olympics took place, he stopped off in Surrey in England and camped in the garden of a young woman called Rosemary Robbins. So if you could, give us the next slide. There she is. She kept big dogs in her garden, so that's her with her dogs. He camped in this garden and he began a courtship, which I'm also going to skip through. Ultimately, they got married. There's one thing I will mention, which was a big factor drawing them together. Rosemary had been involved in the Poplar Rates Rebellion in East London, which again was a successful workers' struggle against austerity measures taken by the government. It's a tremendous story, and Robert thought it was a tremendous story, and I think workers' struggles, especially successful ones, they lit him up, they probably light all of us up. And it was under Rosemary's influence that he made the links with the struggles he'd witnessed in Cork, and his socialist politics did start to fall into place at this stage. So as I say, I'm fast forwarding now through the story of their shotgun wedding and the disastrous early years of their marriage. They were both very young when they met. Robert was only 20, she was only 19. And he treated Rosemary atrociously in the early years of the marriage. He drank too much. He adopted the revoltingly sexist culture that was common in Fleet Street. He was a journalist. He took up gambling with disastrous results for the family. And Rosemary was disgusted with him, and he ended up disgusted with himself. And after this startling epiphany on a London bus, he joined an evangelical cult called the Oxford Group, which Rosemary also joined. And they fell back in love. And for a while they were very happy. And he became a Church of Ireland priest and was eventually posted to St Anne's Cathedral in Belfast. So I've taken you very rapidly through a good few years there, but you can read about them at more length. Unfortunately for his family, he was horribly underpaid. According to the cathedral records, he only received £25 a year, so he rapidly fell into deep debt. But it was far worse for many of his parishioners because this was Belfast during the Depression. Deirdre, his daughter, my mother, and her older brother Tim, they remembered the sight of unemployed men on street corners at this time and their father taking bags of coal to desperate families. Northern Ireland was the last place in the UK that still had the old punitive Victorian system of poor relief, where you either went into a workhouse or, if you could get it, you were given outdoor relief, which had to be earned by hard manual labour, and that was paid a very small, tiny sum of money, never enough, which you lost after a while. Then you were paid in kind, small allocation of food or whatever. The idea being that it was your fault. If you were poor, you should get a job, and you had to be helped back into work, which might remind us of a phrase that's being used at the moment, as they cut benefits again. While Robert was still in his first year as a clergyman in 1932, Belfast was absolutely galvanised by huge protests against the outdoor relief system. And as there's a bit of history that we don't hear much about, I wanted to say something about it here. So if we could have the next picture. There you go. So this is a passage from the book to go with the picture. Robert knew that the poverty created by the depression in Belfast was of a different order from his own. Up to 73% of Belfast's workers in the city's key industry, the shipyards, were laid off. Catholics had always found it harder to get work. Now thousands of Protestants joined them. People from both communities sought exceptional distress relief or outdoor relief from the Board of Guardians. This was given to married men only, taking the form of cash payments for outdoor relief schemes such as road building or other hard labour. In July, an outdoor relief workers committee was set up, led by members of the Revolutionary Workers Groups, a small communist organisation. This committee demanded an increase in the rates paid and an end to payments in kind and piecework. It held its first rally on the 8th of August. A second rally on the 18th of August was larger than even its most optimistic supporters had predicted, and a third on the 31st of August was 20,000 strong. By the 3rd of October, which is what you see there, outdoor relief workers were beginning a solid, determined strike with pickets mounted all over the city. A huge demonstration gathered, defying a ban, and marched around the Catholic Falls Road and the Protestant Shankill district. So that's the huge crowd that had gathered as they marched through these different districts, gathering people as they went. And there was an even bigger demonstration on the 11th of October. Police attacked the marchers, and Protestants and Catholics fought them side by side. And when the police started a house-to-house search in the Falls Road, the word went round the Shankill, and Protestants came out to fight them off. And there was a massive riot which lasted for days. The police were completely ousted. As I say, they fired on the crowds as they left. They injured a lot of people. They killed one Protestant and one Catholic. And then you had these further mass displays of solidarity as people attended the funeral together, 100,000 at least. And this cross-sectarian workers' unity was an absolute nightmare for the Northern Irish political establishment. And the churches were also appalled. The Pope urged vigilance against this outbreak of communism. But the shows of unity continued, and the Board of Guardians had to make a better offer. And in the end they did. And the rate of outdoor relief was almost doubled. So that was a real victory. Unfortunately, it didn't go as far as they would have liked, because it still wasn't offered to anybody unmarried. And the debate continues as to whether they could have held out for more. And the other debate that continues is what could have been done to build on this amazing cross-sectarian unity? Because after this died down, some of the old ways of thinking did come back fairly fast. They flickered into life briefly in 1933, when the largely Protestant workforce of the Great Northern Railway went on strike against a 10% pay cut. And the strike spread to the south and was supported by bus workers and by unofficial action by Belfast dockers. But unfortunately this was sold out, this whole thing was sold out by union leaders who only won a reduced cut of 7% instead of 10%. And then the old habits of sectarian division did reassert themselves. Early in 1933, Robert's third and fourth children were christened. He had 4 children by now. And during the ceremony, we get a hint of the unrest in Belfast at this time. This is after the relief riots. If you could give us the next picture, please. This is a picture of Robert walking to the christening. He's got his second daughter, Davnet, in his arms. Out of the picture are his son, Tim, my mother, Deirdre, and the baby Kit, who was also going to be christened. And walking a few steps behind there, you've got Rosemary. And I think you can see the fraying of the marriage in this picture, because they were both desperately, it was a very unhappy marriage by this time. And it looks to me here, frankly, as if they've just had a bit of a row. My mother wrote an account of what happened at the christening after this picture was taken, which I'll read to you. This is what she says. During the service, just as my father had my sister in his arms and was putting the mark of the cross on her forehead with holy water, there was a crash, maybe a shot, and then a window splintered, and it crashed down, and stones came in, and there was a noise of people shouting outside. My father stopped for a moment, said, "Peace be with you," and then carried on as if not. Oh, he was performing the christening, Robert was. And then he carried on as if nothing had happened. After a while, the noise quietened and pulses returned to normal. And I think this displays of hostility like this towards the church he was working for highlights Robert's conflicted position, because his sympathies lay with the striking, struggling, starving poor of Belfast. But his church opposed the outdoor relief strikes and all workers' struggles and denounced them as communism. It was far more important to keep the status quo than to help the poor. And some individual clergy had worked with the police or pulled strings to ensure that leading activists were losing their jobs. So at the same time, this was about the time Robert started to break some of the strict rules for living that were imposed by the Oxford group. Like he started smoking again, they were supposed to keep to certain rules and rituals, and it became clear to his wife's great distress that he wasn't keeping to them, and in fact he was losing faith with the Oxford group. Its founder and leader, Frank Buchmann, was by this time traipsing around Germany trying to recruit Adolf Hitler to the Oxford group. And when news of this leaked out, of course, an awful lot of its adherents were extremely alienated, and that would also have included Robert, whose politics were moving, as we will later discover, quite fast to the left at this time. Ultimately, the breakdown of Robert's marriage, his loss of faith in his church and the Oxford group, and above all his terrible debts drove him out of Ireland, and he went to London in the spring of 1935. It's a long, sad story, this bit, and again, I do have to leave it to some extent to you to read it yourselves. But Rosemary and the children were forced to do a midnight flit to avoid the family's creditors, who were literally banging on the door, as Deirdre well remembers. And they had to live in great poverty in a series of semi-derelict cottages, while Robert tried to re-enter journalism in London. And at that stage, Robert and Rosemary started writing to each other, and they did actually write each other quite amicable letters. One of the first things Robert did in London was to join the Communist Party, which shows, as I say, how fast he'd been moving to the left while he was in Belfast. In August 1935, the Communist Party would make a massive shift towards the Stalinist idea of the Popular Front. But when Robert joined, a few months before that, well, that's quite a few months, its membership was still committed to building rank-and-file trade unionism, supporting grassroots strikes, fighting homelessness, and opposing fascism on the street. And we know that Robert threw himself into this political activism because MI5 sent spies to Communist Party meetings, and there's an MI5 report which describes Robert as a prominent CP member. Now, obviously, this was all going on against a backdrop of gathering crisis and huge instability across Europe. Hitler had taken power in Germany, Mussolini had taken power in Italy, the shadow of fascism and war was threatening every country. And I wish I could show you a picture of Robert after he went to London or while he was in Spain, but we don't have any pictures of him after he left, the family hasn't anyway, after he left Ireland. We do know that he could only have been hugely influenced by the battles in the streets of London against the black shirts, who were mounting intimidating uniformed marches in many cities. They wanted to copy Mussolini and Hitler by taking over the streets and then grabbing state power. And on the 4th of October 1936, there was a crucial battle against the black shirts at Cable Street in London, which is described in the book as follows. When Robert first arrived in London, people were still talking about a Hyde Park rally Mosley had organised in September 1934, which had been successfully swamped by a demonstration of 150,000 anti-fascists. Since then, there had been innumerable clashes. Now Mosley wanted to stage a big set piece. On the 4th of October, he planned to lead the black shirts into Whitechapel. The prospect of this march was terrifying for Whitechapel's large Jewish population. The British government mobilised over 6,000 police to escort it into the heart of the area. The Communist Party leadership initially urged its members to attend a rally for Spain in Trafalgar Square, only going to the East End later, but they had to change their minds when it was clear that members were going straight to Whitechapel. The fascists who marched that day were met by 20,000 or more members of Jewish organisations, communists, trade unionists, local people, Jewish and non-Jewish, determined that the BUF should not pass. The centre of anti-fascist opposition was Gardener's Corner and Cable Street, off the Whitechapel Road. A barricade was built in Cable Street. As the police tried to clear the way, attacking protesters with baton charges, they were met with sticks and stones. A violent battle between police and anti-fascists ensued, between police, note, and anti-fascists. The police were the main protagonists here, fighting on the side of the British Union of Fascists. Eventually the police had to divert the black shirts away from the East End, but they continued to attack protesters and residents. A total of 150 people were arrested, many were beaten by police. About 170 were injured, including police, women and children. So an incredibly violent battle, but it was the beginning of the decline of the British Union of Fascists. Even with police support, they'd not been able to march through the East End. And Mosley did continue to organise, he continued to hold marches, he continued to hold rallies, they went on for several more years. But his funding from Mussolini and other big donors at home and abroad took a hit, and so did his credibility take a massive hit. And so you could say that this battle, with many other smaller ones, explains why fascist organisations never managed to take street power in Britain in the 1930s and never achieved the same standing as they did in many other countries. So Cable Street left a very important legacy and a model for anti-fascist organisation which is with us to this day. And if we could have the last picture now. I'm going to have to kind of go back a bit in 1936 to talk about Spain. Because to the horror of the Spanish right, in February 1936, I think you could describe it as a rather tentative left-wing coalition called the Popular Front had been elected to government in Spain. And in July 1936, generals in Spain's very large and powerful army had begun a coup against it. And the government refused to arm the workers, but despite being insufficiently armed, a huge revolutionary upsurge by Spanish workers and peasants managed to stop the generals from seizing about 60% of Spain. And after some desperate, fierce battles, they managed to stop them from taking the key cities of Madrid and Barcelona, which were held by the government forces. Spain had, in the process of this, Spain became a beacon of inspiration for the left across Europe. And quite a few people started to go over there to fight. France and Britain drew up a non-intervention agreement in August 1936, promising not to help either side, and that was signed by Germany and Italy, as well as a lot of other countries. But despite this, Hitler and Mussolini were quite blatantly helping the Spanish generals with arms and a huge amount of troops, munitions, arming them very well indeed. And so this posed Stalin didn't want to see a revolution in Spain, but he didn't want to see fascism win there either, because it would release German forces to march east, as he knew that, as Hitler had announced he intended to do, across Eastern Europe and ultimately to Russia. And from August 1936, the Comintern started forming the International Brigades with the aim of performing a kind of holding operation to keep the Spanish Popular Front government in power. And the people who joined the International Brigades came from many countries. Only a few were poets and intellectuals, contrary to the myths. Most of them were ordinary working people who wanted to join their brothers and sisters in Spain. And Robert later recorded in a letter from Spain that some of them mistakenly thought they were joining a Red Army, a people's army, and would elect their own officers and help to fight for a Spanish Revolution. And he also recorded in this letter he wrote from Spain that this was not the case. It wasn't that kind of army. And indeed, some other volunteers didn't join the brigades. They went and they joined other fighting organisations, in many cases to the left of the Communist Party, including anarchist and other groups. But in December 1936, Robert renewed his passport, signed up for the International Brigades, and set off for France. And while I was writing this book, I travelled across Spain from Madrigueras, which is the town where the British battalion, which he joined, was formed, to Castellón, which is I travelled to the battlefield at Jarama, where he was fatally wounded, and to the hospital in Castellón, where he died, and the cemetery there where he was buried, although Franco's regime couldn't allow people like him to stay in their graves, so he was dug up and turfed into a mass grave. And all this time I did feel very aware that he'd written this letter. I feel that his voice is very much there in this part of the book, and I'm going to just read one very short excerpt where he describes a march through Barcelona, a march through Barcelona when he and the others he was travelling with arrived. What a march! Everywhere the people were out to salute, the clenched fist anti-fascist salute. But in particular I remember one woman. She was about 4 foot in height. She wore a brown shawl with a design on the border, very like what an Irish woman from the country wears in town on market days. She carried a basket on her left arm. Her right arm was raised and her hand clenched in the anti-fascist salute. Her face, though, was what mattered. Her hair was black, her forehead wrinkled. Heavy lines marked the sides of her mouth. She stood to attention as we passed, nearly 200 of us, marching in fours, and her mouth was moving rapidly up and down, holding back the tears. Who knows whom she'd lost in the fight against fascism? And he returns to the idea of democracy, which he did discuss at length in the long letter I've mentioned, in this postcard, which I'm going to read to you. Joe's already given you one sentence from it, but I'll give you the rest. This postcard means an enormous amount to our family because he wrote it just before he went into battle at Jarama. My dear, 5 minutes ago I got your letter. There's a trade union delegation here that will take this back. They leave in 10 minutes, so I have time for no more than a card which will have an English postmark. Teach the kids to stand for democracy. Thanks for the parcels. I expect they have been forwarded to me, but posts are held up very long, and especially parcels. Do not worry too much about me. I expect I shall be quite safe. I think I'm going to make quite a good soldier. It was good to contribute to the Harry Pollitt Fund. You'll get news in the Daily Worker from time to time. I still hate fighting, but this time it has got to be done. Unless fascism is beaten in Spain and in the world, it means war and hell for our kids. All the time, when I'm thinking of you and the children, I am glad I have come. Give my love to Tim, Deirdre, Davnet and Kit. Write when you can, it will help. Love to you. So finally, I would pick out the same sentence Joe picked out about if, we need to defeat fascism, because if we don't, it's war and hell for our kids, because we're living in very similar crisis-ridden times as the 1930s, with big leaders of big imperialist powers striking similar postures and taking similar measures, and with a far-right racist party using lies to divide us and to try and make electoral gains, for example, in the upcoming local elections. And the racist lies about migrants and Muslims are very much like the lies told about Jews in the 1930s. We've seen all this before, and we can't let it happen again. So I'd echo what Joe said about the best tribute we can pay to Robert and the rest of the people who went to Spain to fight is to stand up against these things in our own day and say, no passaran.